Thanks for having us
on,
Richard.
I'm Joseph Kishore. I'm running with Jerry White for the Socialist Equality Party, presidential and vice presidential candidates in the U.S. elections. As I said, we're running for as the candidates for the Socialist Equality Party. The Socialist Equality Party is affiliated with the International Committee of the Fourth International, which publishes the World Socialist website. Our campaign is about fighting for socialism and developing an understanding within the working class that socialism is the way forward. We're having this discussion just a couple days after Biden's State of the Union address, and he said that his address was a wake-up call. By that, he meant that it was a call for war. But the real wake-up call for masses of workers and young people, not just in the US, but internationally, is that the capitalist system is leading mankind towards a catastrophe. In the US elections, you have the choice between Trump, who's running to establish a fascistic dictatorship, and Biden, whose central priority is the escalation of war up to and including the use of nuclear weapons.
And who's also, it's important to understand, I don't think that the average person really understands the degree to which you've got this choice between what I would call obvious in-your-face fascism with Donald Trump and this quiet support for a dozen little local fascisms all over the country doing as they please at the state level with the Democrats. There's no real effort to stop the huge amounts of money and military equipment going to police forces that whose membership overlaps disturbingly with the membership of white supremacist organizations. I don't like to use the term infiltrated because I don't believe it's a matter of infiltration as a matter of just policing requires a certain attitude about law and order in society that happens to conform very well with the mindset of these fascist organizations.
Well, you certainly had the situation last week where the governor of New York, Hochul, ordered the dispatch of the National Guard to the New York City subway. And she openly said, look, the Democrats have to prove that we're tough on crime. I mean, the issue is that the logic of Biden and the Democrats' policy of expanding war against Russia, even if it threatens nuclear exchange, the wars that are being prepared, the quote, big one against China. The only way that they can impose such a policy, which is deeply unpopular, opposed in the population, the madness of nuclear war, is increasingly through the suppression of democratic rights. And that's why, a couple of weeks ago, Biden was on the border dueling with Trump over who could attack immigrants more. And Biden said to Trump, join me in passing the most reactionary anti-immigrant legislation in American history.
And the people who ran against building the wall are building the wall.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And it's all subordinate to the overall policy on war. I mean, even at the State of the Union, I mean, he, on the one hand, he said, something about the January 6th being the greatest threat to democracy since the Civil War. And then he was calling on his what he called his Republican friends to join him in passing the legislation on attacking immigrants and financing the war against Russia in particular. I mean, that's his priority. But there's no democratic faction of the ruling elite. I mean, Trump represents a real and the fascistic movement, which he's trying to develop, is a real danger, above all, to the working class. But the Democratic Party, I mean, it's not one can't defend democracy, democratic rights through either of these parties, the parties of war and dictatorship.
Exactly. And increasingly we're seeing this dictatorial attitudes towards foreign policy that leads some people to take these ridiculous positions saying that they believe Trump is being persecuted for being anti-war because of genuine issues with entrenched bureaucracy in the military industrial complex, and not wanting to see any opposition from political figures to the consensus policy, according to the quote unquote experts, who all mysteriously own stock or draw paychecks from defense contractors.
Well, because there are, in Trump's position, there's a certain tactical difference within the ruling class, not over whether to go to war, but who the first enemy is. I mean, the Democrats, their perspective is to, in order to wage war against China, you first have to dismember Russia.
Yes.
And they are totally focused. And as Joe indicated, they've made it quite clear they will work with the most fascistic elements in the Republican Party if they get on board with the funding of the expansion of the war in Ukraine.
Well,
and if I could just finish, in Trump's perspective is that, well, no, the troops should be sent to the border and China should be dealt with first, and perhaps you can even peel Russia off of China. So there are, quote, tactical differences, but both of these parties speak for American imperialism with the completely reckless and mad policy of world war.
You get the idea that Trump wants to try to seamlessly work Russia back into the international framework they were thrown out of when the conflict in Ukraine first started to flare up. And that the Democrats are in favor of keeping him out by any means necessary, and have sort of adhered to the old neoconservative plans of the Project for a New American Century, if anyone else remembers that, where basically the idea was that we had won the Cold War and therefore we should be imposing our will on the former Eastern Bloc and the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, as Jerry indicated, there are certain divisions, and certainly the whole idea of controlling Eurasia. I mean, it's been now 3 decades of unending war. It was centered first in the Middle East, and then Middle East and Central Asia, and now it's developing, or it has developed, into the conflict with Russia. And you can read all sorts of strategy documents about the need to control the Eurasian landmass. How they see this is also connected to the developing conflict with China, the big one, which they call it, Jerry referred to. And there are certain tactical divisions, but both of the parties, I think the point really to stress is they both represent the interests of American imperialism. And to understand and develop an understanding within the working class of the connection between the war that's being waged abroad and the war that's being waged at home. As Jerry was in, I mean, they spend $1 trillion or more every year on the military in one form or another.
And that's just what we know about, and not the money that goes missing and never turns up in audits.
I did in San Diego, I did a calculation because they're raising tuition for students at the UC or the CSU system by like 40% over the next couple of years to get to fill a $1 billion deficit, which is like a 20th of the cost of an aircraft carrier. So I might be getting the numbers wrong, but it's something on that order. I mean, the amount of money which is spent to finance the war machine really means starving everything. Infrastructure is collapsing. There's no money for decent jobs, supposedly, for pay under conditions of soaring prices, public education, the healthcare system, which I know we'll talk about in relationship to COVID, but everything has to be subordinated to war, and the consequences of that are a massive assault, intensification of the assault on the working class at home. And these are really two sides of the same ruling class war, the war abroad and the war at home, which we're trying to really develop an understanding in the working class. I mean, there is broad opposition. The support for the war in Ukraine is within the ruling elites, privileged sections of the upper middle class, which are sort of, gung-ho on, let's drive the world towards nuclear war. Within the working class, there's broad unease, opposition. There's also a lack of real understanding as a result of the continuous propaganda in the media of what is even happening. They're talking about sending NATO troops now directly into the conflict, which would mean direct war with Russia. What are the implications of that? How many millions of people, are they prepared to sacrifice to control Eastern Europe, to drive this to military victory against Russia? And workers have to understand that. And when they do, the opposition grows.
No, and I think that's true. I also think there's a growing awareness among at least disabled Americans as the country and the government seem to be going through this cultural attempt to forget COVID exists. That there is a growing awareness about how government policy ends up fighting the war at home and who's getting hurt by it.
Well, we're discussing before that there has been a long discussion in the Democratic and Republican parties about the problem of life existence, that people are living too long. That this is an unbearable burden on Social Security and Medicare and so forth. And of course, last year you saw Macron in France increase the retirement age. And there were mass protests in the streets. And then he, by executive fiat, imposed it. And it's not separate from the fact that the French government is proposing the sending of NATO troops into Ukraine. They're all talking about a wartime economy.
And this is where I have to break in and remind everyone that Macron was the French, we have to stop the fascists from winning candidate who is now imposing these fascistic policies on his country so that they can avoid a fascist takeover.
Yeah, right.
That doesn't sound at all like Biden.
Well, these are similar processes all over the world. Yeah, I mean, and the same arguments are always made. Well, in order to stop fascism, you have to back one or another candidate and Macron he's the representative of the banks. That's how he's known. I mean, and there's mass opposition. But it's similar really in every country. That's also one of the most important themes actually of our election campaign. We're not just running to develop a socialist movement in the working class here. All the problems that we confront, that workers confront everywhere, are global problems: world war, dictatorship, inequality, the pandemic, which you referred to and is ongoing, which I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk more about. But these are global problems. The climate change. I mean, last month was the 9th straight highest, temperature month in history. And, what are the capitalist powers doing? Nothing.
Well, I will say that there are certain people among the capitalists themselves who have very strong ideas about how life expectancy being too high, and the solution to high life expectancy and the solution to climate change being things like pandemics.
Absolutely. Although really they want to spend all the money on the rich and on the military rather than taking care of people as they age. There are still more than 1,000 people dying every week in the United States, predominantly the elderly, those with disabilities. They claim the pandemic is over. I think it's like 5,000 a month. There are 20 million people suffering from the impact of long COVID. And it's treated, of course, there's no resources, there's no research into the impact of long COVID. But there is a real eugenicist character to their policy. Well, the elderly, and they've stated this more or less openly on various occasions, the elderly should just go and die. And then there should be lower life expectancy. People shouldn't live that long. And therefore it will free up resources for important things like, preparing for World War III. But I would say that, with our campaign, and this is I think it's a unique element, we are fighting to alert workers and young people that the pandemic continues. In all of our campaign events, we mask, we speak to workers about it. that the pandemic is continuing, that the threat remains, even if you are vaccinated, you can still spread the virus.
It's worth noting that as of the summer of 2022, 60% of the people who are dying of COVID are vaccinated, which is the natural progression when you have a rapidly mutating virus that has essentially been allowed to go out of control and is therefore changing faster than the vaccine technology can currently keep up with it because of the complete lack of mitigation efforts.
Right. And of course, the CDC has just changed its guidelines again and telling people that it's all right to go to work if you don't, quote, have symptoms, if your fever is gone. And of course,
no, even if it's just getting better.
Yeah.
Getting better. Right.
Yeah.
So, of course, we know that even asymptomatic people can spread the disease. And this has always been about the prioritization of production and profit rather than taking the measures that are needed to protect human life. In fact, in the first stages in March 2020, it wasn't the employers or the government that pushed for the shutdowns. It was actually a development of a movement in the working class, which actually began in Italy, some of the hardest hit areas, and then spread to Canada, the United States. Auto workers, where I'm talking from today in Detroit, spontaneously walked out of the factories in opposition to the union apparatus. The UAW is insisting they stay and work. And workers carried out walkouts in Detroit and Toledo and other places, which actually forced the shutdown of the auto industry in March 2020 for about 2 months. But of course, then they worked very rapidly to reopen the operations. And we worked with scientists who demonstrated that COVID is spread in aerosolization in the air, that there could be measures taken if there was a sufficient shutdown, if workers were compensated any loss of income. And of course, those measures were initially taken in China and led to the saving of millions of lives. But this is not possible or viable on a national basis. So ultimately, the pressure of Apple and the other transnational companies and the Chinese regime reopened the economy to the horrific deaths of more than 1 million people.
And they were essentially given no choice by the system, which everybody has to conform to in order to participate in the international trade system as a quote unquote free country.
That's right. That's right. The capitalist regime in China is seeking, further investments and so on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to understand that everything is ultimately being balanced against a bottom line by accountants whose job is just to maximize profits for shareholders and who are really allowed. Their own system tells them that they're not ethically allowed to care about anything else but maximizing shareholder profits, which of course leads to a total of abandonment of all other ethics in the pursuit of this supposed professional ethical obligation.
Yeah. Well, and the role of the media has been really criminal. I mean, just the level of misinformation, disinformation about the pandemic. I mean, people just don't know. People don't know that you can still spread the virus if you're vaccinated. People don't know even about the fact that the virus is airborne, that it's transmitted through aerosols, and therefore the significance of masking. There are important preventative mitigation measures which could be employed in buildings, but there just aren't, because of course that would require resources. So I think the media, I'm just getting actually some notes from people following this, that that our stream may be choked on Twitter, that it's being marked as sensitive, or
it always marks my stuff as sensitive until it gets a certain number of views, and then it seems to go away. The code is so My feeling, even more than the conspiracy theories, is that there's always been a problem with Twitter's code. That it has been,
but there is also certainly,
certainly there's suppression.
I mean, I noticed on my TikToks, that some of them get very few, in contrast to earlier videos, get very few views.
Well, the algorithms have all been changed in order to prioritize corporate media over the rest of us.
Yeah. Well, they fear social media, particularly with Gaza and the genocide, people getting information.
Then on top of that, there's the silly billionaire spat between Elon Musk and the Substack people, which results in Substack links being deprivileged on Twitter. And Elon Musk's falling out with his favorite journalist, Matt Taibbi, over Matt Taibbi running his career platform off of Substack instead of Twitter. And so Elon Musk doesn't like him anymore. It's just so ridiculous how much power these big tech oligarchs have. And I use the word oligarchs on purpose because if they were Russian, we would not call them billionaires or moguls. We would call them oligarchs.
Yeah. Bess, you looked like you wanted to say something. Hi, by the way. Nice
sorry, I was a little bit late. Nice to officially meet you guys. Did I want to say something?
I don't know. You looked like you were about to. Anyways, nice to meet
I don't know. I don't know. I kind of feel, a little bit like I'm the kind of person that just sort of listens and absorbs about COVID information. I'm not at the forefront. I was a little bit taken in by misinformation earlier on so I have been re-educating myself since then. So that's why this conversation, I'm sitting in the back seat a little bit because I'm just going, I agree. But if you want to keep the conversation to Palestine or anything else that, I'll jump in then, but
well, it would be very good actually to talk about that.
Yes,
I would just say that, the World Socialist website has really been the most significant source for actual science outside of scientific publications and others. And there's scientists who are doing important work. But in terms of actually news and political publications, the World Socialist website has been the best source of actual the science of the virus. I know there's a reason for that, because the science, to the extent people understand the science, that really goes against the policy of the ruling class of mass infection. People will, develop a different understanding of what has to be done and what can be done. The idea that there's no choice but to accept, and it doesn't just apply to COVID, it applies to other diseases and viruses, just to accept mass infection, death, it's wrong.
The statement that there is no other choice but to do this logically implies that there are other choices that someone does not want to take, and therefore they are specifically advocating this one.
Yeah.
Because if there are not other choices, you don't feel the need to repeatedly belabor the fact that there are no choices.
Well, we said at the very beginning that the response to the COVID was the official response, that is, would be conditioned by the existing social and property relations of capitalism.
Yeah.
It's not just in the heads of this or that politician. Capitalism is a system which has evolved historically based on the private ownership of the vast industries, including social media, of course. And the subordination of human needs to private profit. And it's also a society, even though the more and more the whole world's people have been interconnected globally, capitalism is rooted in this vicious competition between nation states. So that prohibited any rational and scientific response. But it also demonstrated, as Joe was indicating, that if these voices, scientific voices, could be heard, it's not that the population is, irreversibly backward or, it supported Trump's policies. It's the question of the development of a leadership that tells the truth to the population. I mean, we had members of our party out at an Anheuser-Busch picket line out near Fort Worth, Texas, and the so-called red state, and the workers were saying how horrible the impact of COVID had been, that they were forced to work. They were called, the beer workers were essential workers, throughout the COVID. They talked about losing their family members or terrified of bringing it home,
It's remarkable how many industries were given an essential label by cooperative state governments in order to keep operating during what the right would have you believe were these ridiculously invasive and heavily policed shutdowns of large sections of American society.
Yeah,
which is not to say that there aren't people who experienced it that way briefly because of the conditions of their workplace. But that was not the general experience of people at large. In California, the movie industry was given an essential industry label so that Hollywood could keep making movies with large numbers of people on sets, potentially passing COVID amongst each other and taking it home to their families in the middle of the most restrictive period of the so-called lockdowns.
I think one of the first media outlets, I guess, to do that, it was a soap opera, and the biggest controversy was, are they going to mask on screen and blah blah blah. And I think what they had them do is they masked while they weren't shooting or something ridiculous like that. It was just, I remember that conversation. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, well, we referred to the pandemic as a trigger event, and I think that it has had a colossal impact on all of society and politics. I mean, it's worth, you were referring to, but the sort of fascistic movement which Trump has tried to develop, and then the coup culminating in the coup of January 6th. I mean, the essential or the center of their line was the demand for an end to all restrictions on the spread of the pandemic. I mean, that was also behind the plot to assassinate governors. Of course, the Democrats have implemented it. I mean, Biden has implemented that policy since coming to office.
The actual Biden COVID policy is the Trump COVID policy. There's no functional difference in the actual goals and methods. Yeah. There is rhetorical difference.
Sorry.
But the goals and methods are the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, practically speaking, people don't forget that Trump is the one that gave us stimuluses and Biden didn't. That's something huge. Biden could have continued that, and we needed it.
But
I also wanted to just slip in real quick when we were talking before about essential workers and who was labeled as one. I mean, I really think you can see the class difference between how one remembers COVID. If you remember COVID by being stuck at home and your biggest problems were you had to stare at your wall every day, I mean, that means that you were privileged enough to shelter yourself, whereas most of us were still at work. I was an essential worker. I didn't have to work at McDonald's. Thank God. I was taking care of a special needs girl. So that was a different situation entirely. But, I mean, it was a big difference. I remember having to tell a lot of my friends who had corporate jobs, no, I can't meet with you at 3 p.m. I can't, we can't go grab brunch together today because I still have a normal job in life, and my life hasn't changed whatsoever. So a lot of people, I think, experience that.
Well, I work in technical support for a company that manufactures lighting controls, and I help electricians troubleshoot new installs and tell them how to wire things up, send manuals. That was considered an essential industry because it's infrastructure. And so I was going into the office every day once my paid time off that I had been using to shelter in place was used up.
Yeah.
So,
Well, what they meant by essential was essential to the profits of the capitalists. And let's not forget that they used the pandemic to hand trillions of dollars to the banks, which has to all be paid through the exploitation of the working class. You know, and the line was, of course, the cure can't be worse than the disease, which was first proposed by the New York Times' Thomas Friedman and then adopted by Trump. That is, that the measures necessary to save lives and public health can't be that they have to be subordinate to profit and the wealth of the ruling class. And the one thing I would just add on that, though, I think that because I think it's related to what we're talking about earlier about, you know, the war and the genocide in Gaza, because you have a sort of, you know, we refer to it in the New York statement of the on the World Socialist website of the normalization of mass death, and you have the normalization of nuclear war and the normalization now of genocide. It all speaks to a ruling elite, which really is, you know, sort of careening society towards barbarism, and which has absolute contempt for human life. There's a certain madness to it, but it's a madness which is rooted in social class interests, in which everything is subordinated to the interests of this financial oligarchy, which runs society, controls the whole political system. And that's really the issue.
And dictates ideas of realism and possibilities and logic to the ruling class by giving them a set of lines they can't cross. Any public debate is acceptable within these lines, and nothing outside of them should be allowed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you look at the structure of inequality that has emerged. What are the figures we've been pointing at? What is it? 84 billionaires own more wealth than the bottom half of the world's population. How much they've absorbed in the course of the pandemic. And the interests of this ruling class is so antithetical to the interests of society as a whole that they cannot carry out measures with any democratic consensus. They have to impose these measures. I mean, they're not telling, you know, Biden did not start the State of the Union address by saying, you know, there is a danger that we are sliding to World War III. I want to know tonight, does the American public want me to pursue a more aggressive conflict with Russia and China that may lead to World War III? That's not how he began it. He said, we have to fund Ukraine. We have to have more money. This is an existential battle for democracy, even though he's backing a regime that is supported by fascists, even though this war didn't fall out of the sky. For 3 years, the United States has been an endless war.
Whenever the subject of fighting for democracy in the Ukraine comes up, I always want to ask people the same question, which is, do we still know what happened to the leaders of the Young Communist League of Ukraine? Has anyone ever found them? Do we know if they're alive, dead, in prison?
Yeah,
I mention that because they were disappeared very early in the conflict. And even if they are not an actual communist organization really working for revolutionary socialism, their disappearance sort of belies the claims of democracy on behalf of the current Ukrainian state.
And there's growing opposition in Ukraine to the consequences of this. I mean, the imperialist powers have used the population of Ukraine as cannon fodder, and they have a right-wing regime infested with Nazis promoting, you know, outright fascists and fascist collaborators, Stepan Bandera, the Nazi collaborator, you know, renaming streets for, you know, outright anti-Semites and fascists. I mean, you know, this is the government, but there's opposition within Ukraine to this. I mean, you know, this is imperialism. I think the other point, you know, for all those who may have been taken in about, you know, the so-called war for democracy and self-determination in Ukraine, it's the same people, the same governments that are backing the genocide in Gaza, carried out by these. It's not two different wars. It's not two different, you know, oh, somehow they're waging a war for democracy in Ukraine and they're supporting an outright genocide. It's the same war. It's the same class interests.
It all fits together. And you see the same thing in Sudan, where one of the two factions responsible for the ongoing atrocity there is being funded by the Israeli Defense Force. You see it in the Congo, where people are being killed on a ridiculous level in the pursuit of lithium rights by, and this is the deep irony, the military currently committing the genocide now is the military of Rwanda. And the government in power in Rwanda is the government that came into power as a reaction against the Rwandan genocide in the 90s.
Well, this is the impact of imperialism, and they have it. I think what you're raising, lithium. I mean, there's rare earths. I mean, one of the main driving factors in the conflict with Russia is they want to open up Russia's vast resources to direct exploitation. The conflict with China, it's a major factor.
There was no secret of it when Donald Trump named the former CEO of Exxon as his Secretary of State.
Right. No, there's open discussion of a new scramble for Africa. As you say, in the Congo, cobalt and lithium in South America. Biden's pushing for electric vehicles has very little to do with the environment. It has to do with a vicious competition with China. And there was just last week a paper put out by the think tank, the Washington think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, called Rebuilding the Arsenal of Democracy. And it was about how the worries that the United States, which spends more than the next 10 countries combined on the military, is somehow falling behind China. Therefore, you have to transform the American economy for war. And that includes, as I was mentioning before, there's a reason why UAW President Sean Fain was in the gallery at the State of the Union address. The Biden administration's policy is to incorporate the trade union bureaucracy into the state for war.
Yes.
And I don't care what the Democratic Socialists of America say about Fain, and he's a reform candidate and he wants a ceasefire. They endorsed Biden.
They loudly endorsed Biden.
Yeah, they did it at a UAW convention, a political action convention in Washington. And when their own members stood up chanting ceasefire, they were dragged out of the hall by the Secret Service agents and UAW bureaucrats. But Fain concluded a deal in this last round of negotiations, which will enable the American automakers to destroy tens of thousands of jobs as they convert to electric vehicles. And in fact, Fain loves the phrase arsenal of democracy too, because that refers to when the UAW during World War II actually helped the auto industry transform to build weapons.
Yes.
And there was also a no strike pledges that made strikes illegal throughout World War II. And that's the role that he is seeking to play. But there's huge opposition in the working class to that.
He's not even asking for the kind of concessions that the UAW leaders of the time demanded in return for their support, which is something that we lose, is that the notion of achievable reform by even the so-called most radical reformers is so small that you can't, that today's workers can't even imagine the possibility of something that actually happened in Italy, where Lamborghini workers won a 4-day work week. But it's been almost completely not reported, almost as if they don't want us to know that this happened, because we might think that it could happen here if it could happen in Italy.
Well, but also workers are increasingly, here in Detroit, where I'm speaking from, there's a Stellantis, which is the Fiat Chrysler that merged with Peugeot and so forth. But workers are facing huge job cuts. They fired 2,300 casual workers, temporary workers, who pay UAW dues, But we've been working with these workers, in fact, to establish connections with the Mexican workers, with the Italian workers. And Stellantis is cutting jobs all over the world. The shorter work week is being gutted in Europe as it is, we never had it here at all. But these are global companies, and the unions are all nationalist.
Yes.
They're just warming up now for a campaign of anti-Chinese chauvinism in the name of, quote, saving American jobs, which never saved a single job.
And
but where it
was
an international strategy.
The jobs keep getting shipped to the same places. The whole genocide in Palestine is happening on the scale it is because it happens to create a system of forced labor that is immensely profitable for countries invested in the Israeli economy.
Yeah, that's absolutely something we should be talking about. On top of the genocide is the apartheid. And they've been using the Palestinians' labor for years.
And there's a pass system, just like under American slavery, where you have to have, or South African apartheid, where you have to have the pass to be in the right neighborhood at the right time of day.
Well, in his State of the Union, Biden said, "Oh, this all began on October 7th." I mean, what a lie! There's been a decades of oppression. In Israel, of course. Biden has many times repeated the statement, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent it. And what he meant by that has nothing to do with concerns with the Jewish people internationally, as he's sort of presenting it now. He said it very clearly in 1986. He said we'd have to be spending a lot more on aircraft carriers in the Middle East if we didn't have the Israeli military. So it's always been part of the broader. And I think it's really critical for those who are outraged by the genocide and have protested in the millions to understand that, when we're speaking, you can't really talk about the genocide without talking about imperialism. Yes, this is the product of the reactionary character of the whole Zionist attack on socialism and internationalisalism. But this is a genocide made in Washington. It's the imperialist.
And the history.
Right.
If I could just make one point about, and we can perhaps return to this, but about the question of the rank and file committees. Jerry was actually, it's worth noting, Jerry's on the front page of the Detroit News yesterday in a photo that was taken because the Socialist Equality Party has been involved in organizing and encouraging workers, temporary workers who've been fired, to organize rank and file opposition to the trade union apparatus. Of course, the Detroit News doesn't note that the photograph includes Jerry and also the Assistant National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party, Lawrence Porter. But the SEP has been involved very much in trying to develop and encourage rank and file organizations internationally to unite the working class in opposition to the corporations, but to transfer power to the rank and file, to oppose the reactionary nationalist corporatist trade union apparatus, which works at every point to suppress the class struggle. We supported the campaign of Will Layman in the presidential election of the UAW.
Who I had on this show
as a socialist, as an internationalist, calling for the abolition of the apparatus, and got a very significant vote among workers, which also indicates the support that there does exist for a real alternative to the
And it's worth noting that was an extremely low turnout election in which less than 3%, I think it was, of the entire union membership eligible to vote actually voted.
Well, it ended up voting for Fain. He's president 3% because he really actually got only 3% of the rank and file vote. The total vote was somewhat higher. But yeah, there was a deliberate suppression of the vote because the UAW apparatus in very direct, and I think this again ties into what Jerry was raising about the war, because they have worked closely with Biden. Fain is in daily contact, or has been, throughout the so-called strike, which was a phony, it wasn't a stand-up strike, it was a bend-over strike. They kept workers on the job throughout. He was working closely with Biden because it's not just a question of imposing the demands of the corporations. It's a question of imposing the interests of American imperialism. and the integration of the apparatus. So Biden calls out Fain at the State of the Union, and Fain stands up and raises his fist, as if there has anything to do with the interests of the working class. They're utilizing the apparatus to suppress the class struggle and subordinate workers to war. That is the role of the apparatus. Trotsky said, in times of war and revolution, trade union officials generally become bourgeois ministers. Yes. And that's what Fain would like to do if he's not currently.
And that is
bring him. Who knows?
That is very accurate, and we can see it happening. And again, it brings me back to this whole, you can see how in the early history of the labor movement, certain privileges were won from the working class by fighting and dying for them. And that the union apparatus that was built by the blood and struggle of workers now has a tendency to dismiss any of the tactics that actually won them their current positions of power and influence in the liberal state, because that would be illegal. If you ask representatives of union bureaucracies why broader solidarity strikes don't happen, the answer is inevitably that would be against the law. From union bureaucrats, from labor reporters, from members of the Women's Auxiliary, of the United Mine Workers.
Right.
It's fascinating how this idea that we have to follow the law, that was very much the antithesis of how the privileges that what Lenin would have called the labor aristocracy in the United States won those privileges. They don't even respect their own liberal history.
Well, of course, those early struggles, in the history of the American working class, these great struggles were led by socialists.
Yes.
And left-wing militants, and including
the apparatus of the AFL.
Yes,
yeah.
including the Trotskyists, who led the great general strike in Minneapolis that put the Teamsters Union on the map as a national force. But certainly, you mentioned Reuther, who was a member of the Socialist Party, but very much on the right wing, and the exchange that was made with Roosevelt during the so-called arsenal of democracy was aimed very much to incorporate the trade unions, solidify the membership. One of the things that was handed over by the Roosevelt government was the automatic dues deduction that gave a flow of income to the union apparatus. Before then, workers had to pay voluntarily their union dues, and the union officials would have to come around, and the workers would say, "What did you do for me this week?" before I give you a penny. So part of the integration of the trade unions for war was this quid pro quo. And by the late 40s, as Reuther was heading to become the president of the UAW, he carried out a vicious anti-communist purge. So the union apparatus emerged as it is in its present form through the purging of the genuine left wing and socialists. And of course, as you correctly said, the sit-down strikes were totally illegal. The Supreme Court denounced it as illegal. And the union bureaucracy is not anti-capitalist. Its whole function is to work within the capitalist system and defend those legalities. And of course, by the development of the time of globalization, the unions repudiated any opposition to the corporations. And in the name of, quote, saving jobs or insourcing, they told the employers, don't go overseas for cheap labor. We'll guarantee you the cheap labor and no strikes and exploitation right here. And that's where Fain comes out of. He was a decades-long union bureaucrat, and it took, the elements like the DSA to sort of put socialist colors. So he wears an Eat the Rich T-shirt, and then he supports Biden, Genocide Joe.
and this is where, and I go back to, there are so many good Lenin quotes about today's about that end up being about the DSA. Another one is when he was talking about the British Labour Party and similar groups in Western Europe at the time, but it really describes the what I would call the petty bourgeois class character of the DSA really well. They want socialism without the working class.
Yeah, without any attack on capitalism, with the permission of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, well, you can go back to Marx, though, as well, in the 1850 address to the Central Committee of the Communist League, where he talks about the petty bourgeoisie, which wants to make society more comfortable for themselves, not a radical redistribution, reorganization. And he was talking about a different stage when there was actually a democratic radical petty bourgeoisie. I mean, I think it's important to understand these issues in class terms, because we talk about the DSA. I mean, what are the class interests that they represent? Privileged sections of the upper middle class, those, aspiring for positions within the trade union apparatus where you can make 150 grand a year.
And wait, let me just slip in real quick that you're starting to see a lot of rhetoric coming out of the Democratic Party, the DSA, and a lot of local candidates specifically appealing to the middle class instead of the working class, instead of the lower class.
And when they talk about the middle class, it's a privileged section. It's also
politicians use middle class as a code, because in the actual class structure, the term middle class is very nebulous and weaselly and doesn't actually commit to who you're talking about.
So on large sections of what would previously be considered middle class are realizing they're working class. But that's not really what the DSA
and large portions of people that we as working class people would consider wealthy members of the owning class or the privileged boss class see themselves as middle class, and politicians see themselves as middle class. And the reason that myths about Joe Biden's working class character persist to this day are because the media people around Biden and Biden all see themselves together as middle class.
Yeah, well, the senator from DuPont, as he was known. I mean, you made the point in the State of the Union. I've represented a state with more corporations incorporated in it than any other, and I berepresent them well.
Well,
I mean,
being the senator from DuPont to the senator from Bank of America.
Yeah, but this is the Democratic Party. It's a party of Wall Street, of the military intelligence agencies, the CIA. You have this phenomenon of the CIA Democrats. Which we've written about, combined with sections of the upper middle class around issues of identity and other questions. And the Republicans exploit that. They exploit the fact that the Democratic Party is hated and broad sections of the working class. It does not. One thing is interesting. I mean, you do not get, when we speak to workers, you don't get workers who say, "Oh, Biden's my man." I really like Biden. None. There's absolutely. I mean, people. There'll be workers who will vote for the Democratic Party just because of sort of habit, I suppose. But there's not support. And so I think that the political situation is such that you have an enormous anger among workers. There's no political representation. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of which the ruling class promotes and exploits. But you have a vast political vacuum. And the question is, what is the perspective that's going to have to be developed in these conditions? And we say it's a socialist perspective, an internationalist perspective. And that's what we're fighting for in the elections, that there is a development, not just of an industrial rebellion of workers, which there has to be, mass strikes and protests and demonstrations, but that it's really animated by a political understanding of the basic issue of socialism. And the one point about the history is very important, because socialism, and other thing I find is when talking to young people, you ask, well, what is socialism? There's not a real understanding. I think it varies.
Socialism is social security. That's what everybody's been programmed to believe now.
But socialism is the political expression of the interests of the working class,
yes,
against exploitation, against a system which is based upon, their labor, the labor of the great majority, goes towards the profits of the tiny few. I mean, that is capitalism. Socialism is the expression of the interests of the working class to overthrow capitalism and create a society based on equality. That's what socialism is. But we have to fight.
I would like to ask you a couple questions if we can sort of slide the subject. I'm glad that you brought it up. I would love to talk to you a little bit about culture wars and why you feel they are a distraction from the class struggle. And I also, I was listening a little bit to your lecture on the 1619 Project right before we were speaking. And oh my goodness, that's my parents-in-law, sorry. That's why I keep muting myself, is because they're watching a game or something and they're being loud. But anyway, so I would like to talk to you a little bit more about that. I am curious to know, why do you honestly believe that gender? First of all, I want to understand if you sort of lump race and gender and sexuality all together as a marginalized group in that conversation. Like, is that part of the class war, or is it just about race for you?
I'm not sure if I understand your question entirely, but I would answer it this way. First of all, I mean, the Socialist Equality Party, we defend democratic rights for everyone. And there are critical democratic issues. For example, the attack on the right to an abortion, which is escalating throughout the country. The SEP opposes all forms of racism and backwardness. With Trump, you have a real effort to develop a fascistic movement, including the revival of, everything which, all the garbage of the ideologies of the past that will be revived. And a socialist movement has to fight against that. The point that we have really developed, including in relationship to the 1619 Project, but in other forms as well, we talk about identity politics. We're talking about a type of politics which raises or asserts that the fundamental differences in society are not class differences. They're the conflict between the genders. They're the conflict between races.
Right.
Right. For example,
so my question to you is that I don't understand why you can't see them as the same struggle, or do you?
See what is the same struggle?
Because again, I cannot talk about my class situation without talking about my situation as being a woman, because there are several things in my life that happened to me because I was a woman that have put me in the working class, in the lower class, in essentially poverty and disabled. And I do not see these struggles as separate. So when you're talking to me about identity politics as a distraction, I have a different understanding of identity politics, because here's what bothers me about the conversation in general. It's just not just with you guys, but in general, is that there are, when people talk about identity politics, they're often reading stuff in the Atlantic. They're often reading co-opted corporate media, but they don't understand that this conversation was actually going on under, with working class people, under the radar for a long time. Millennials have been developing a language with each other about these issues. We have been discussing these issues without your knowledge, because we have been doing it in small social media circles and without the microphone of the national media. So that's why it concerns me when I hear people say this is a distraction to keep us divided. And, this is not something like, I have a master's degree. Okay. I have a master's degree, but for some reason, I've never been able to make more than $40,000 a year. That doesn't make sense, but it does make sense if you know the circumstances of my life, and if you know the circumstances of my life influenced by my gender. And there are other, plenty of other cases, and you can argue on a larger scale that there are plenty of opportunities or there are plenty of instances where marginalized communities have grown growth, and then it has been stolen from them, right? So that puts them in one class, and then plummets them to another, and that's again only based on their race, right?
So you have to remember that when we're talking about identity politics in the mainstream media, we are talking about a tendency to completely divorce all of these issues, which all have a strong class component, from the issue of class itself, which is to say, the best example I can think of is disability, because it is an identity that everyone will eventually share at some point in their life if they live long enough.
Mm-hmm.
The class implications of what it means to be disabled are very different. If you are a member of a privileged class, you can experience many of the same privileges that any other member of that privileged class can, despite your disability.
For me and not for me, right?
Sorry?
Socialism for the rich, everybody else is F. Everybody else is the worker providing you the socialism.
And it's important to understand that America's class system has highly racialized aspects because of the whiteness of the American ruling class and the belief in the need for a permanent underclass that can always be used to divide the labor aristocracy from the rest of the working class.
And also, again, the history of who is able to access what kinds of jobs.
Well, actually, it would be helpful actually if we were to also not look at this simply as an American issue, because the capitalist class throughout the world has always exploited racial, ethnic, religious, linguistic differences. I mean, the British ruling classes were expert at this. Shiite versus Shia, and so on.
I don't disagree with that at all. I think that they are.
If I could finish for a moment, it's very critical to understand that the source of all of these discriminations, and they're real issues of discrimination, is a system of capitalist exploitation, the exploitation of the vast majority of society by a tiny minority. But in the 1960s, the Democratic Party perfected the policy of exploiting genuine grievances in order to cultivate a constituency for capitalist politics. I mean, and it wasn't just the Democrats. I mean, Richard Nixon was one of the first to coin the term black capitalism. He said, these people want black power, we'll give them black power. They had an understanding that they had to develop a constituency among sections of the population that had grievances in order to divert an understanding that the cause of racism, the cause of the oppression of women is capitalism, and that it's not going to be eliminated by breaking the glass ceiling and bring more women CEOs or more black CEOs or Supreme Court justices or generals.
I absolutely agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. I reject the Sheryl Sandberg sort of lean in feminism. So I definitely, I definitely acknowledge your points. You're not wrong about that whatsoever. However, we, I like to talk about, particularly in this country, this is my experience, and this is, again, the country that you guys are running to be president of. So I like to keep it very specific to America, because we are a unique incident, because we have basically had slavery as the root of our productivity since, again, the beginning of America. We have a unique social structure that involves racism, that involves, and again, it's different. It's different for, women. It's different for the LGBTQ plus community. But it's, it's rooted in the system of patriarchy that is associated with the plantation system, associated with the landowner system. And again, that is something that is based on, if going back further, that is something that's based on the feudal system and the aristocracy. And that's something I can absolutely see the connections of. But because of the particularities of slavery in this country is to do with race, I do believe that you cannot separate the conversation. But on the other hand, I will say this. I will say that I do believe that you cannot have a conversation about race or identity politics without talking about class as well. You are absolutely right in that. I believe that, the polar extremes of this argument is wrong. I believe that we need to be able to come together with a singular rhetoric to incorporate sort of both sides of this argument. Yuzi?
Could I just make some points on this? I think, first of all, that the United States is not unique. I mean, obviously, every country has a certain unique history. But in relationship to slavery, I mean, first of all, we should recognize that there was a Second American Revolution that abolished the institution of slavery. But aside, and there's a lot of historical issues which are raised. I would encourage you, if you haven't already. You said you were reading my lecture on race, class, and socialism.
Yes, I intend to. I would love to talk to you about this further. Also,
sure, that would be great. But that was the point. That's part of a broader book that was published on the 1619 Project and the Racialist Falsification of History, edited by David North and Tom Mackaman, which also brings together a lot of interviews which the World Socialist website carried out with historians of the Civil War and the American Revolution in opposing the 1619 Project. I would just say that I think that what you're raising in terms of your analysis is along the lines of intersectionality theory, which presents, and actually I deal with this a bit in the lecture because it's connected to the origins of identity politics and affirmative action, the Combahee River Collective. There was, a systematic effort to downgrade the position of class. So class just becomes one of a many number of different identities in this telling. There's no sort of fundamental division in society that is class. But Marxists have always insisted that class conflict is at the root of capitalist society. Well, not just capitalist society, it's the root of all of history is a history of class conflict, as Marx says in the Communist Manifesto. Class is fundamental because it's at the basis of production. All of society is organized around production, and class is the division which is rooted in the process of production. And the interests of all workers, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual or any sexual identity or any other division, is their class interests. And one of the, I do think that, just the last point I'd make, and then I do think that one of the consequences of the promotion of identity politics, and it is promoted by the Democratic Party in particular, the New York Times, is to create this myth of the privileged white working class, which is very dangerous. First of all, it's false. The majority of, there are racial disparities, but the majority of poor people in the United States are white. The majority, actually, of those killed, the plurality of those killed by police are white. Again, there is racial disparities, but to sort of the argument of the privileged white working class. It's false, and it plays into the hands of the Republican Party, which then utilizes that. Oh, we're the party, which of course is a lie. But the fight for the
narrative to be put forth by the Republican Party, because they don't want you to listen legitimately to the
You're both right.
Of color.
The thing is that you're both right.
Go ahead, Chris. Tell me.
So the Republicans are playing a very complicated game of identity politics themselves, whereas they attempt to repeatedly center white Christian male identity within a framework of American democracy, by which they mean capitalism, in a way that reinforces the hierarchies of the existing ruling class system, which is ultimately capitalist. Now, this is why I was talking about a permanent underclass before, because the idea of a permanent underclass is inherently divisive to the working class because it appeals to the labor aristocracy, which is very different from what we think of as the white working class. And American class consciousness is false. And this false class consciousness of America is no more clearly revealed than in discussions of the so-called white working class that actually revolves around the petty bourgeois. And these organizations that claim to be white working class on the far right inevitably pursue a petty bourgeois class character and not a working class character.
That's true.
You see it every time. They will talk about uniting the working class, but their actual class character is not anything resembling working class. The Boogaloo Boys are an excellent example of this, where they cosplay this sort of rebellious image of what they see as working class, when this is actually a rebellion that is only actually available to people whose parents can afford to pay some of their expenses.
Well, it's the outlook of the libertarians, isn't it?
Yes.
The petty bourgeois is being crushed by the bigger corporations and by globalization, and we want to have no taxes on the businesses. We want no child labor laws. We want no minimum wage laws, I would make the point, look, Trump is also not just appealing to white. He's also appealing to black workers, a section of the petty bourgeois also.
Yeah.
And what is it about?
Well, let me just hop in here and make a couple points.
Workers, that the cause of their economic distress is the immigrants who are stealing their jobs, and to develop American nationalism. But the fact is that I think, as Joe made the point, that the Trump is able to exploit the endless slicing and dicing of the population against one another into competing identities. He's able to exploit that, And what the heck? What does white privilege mean in Elkhart, Indiana, where there's mass unemployment, poverty? And the question we're fighting to do is unite the working class as a class.
This is my problem. This is my inherent problem with this conversation. I'm sorry. Because this is a misunderstanding of what the idea of white supremacy means. The idea of white supremacy being baked into this society and being baked into the government, okay? This is not about whether or not somebody who is white and also has my job is doing better than me. Okay, that is something that you're right. Trump focuses on and drives a wedge between workers with this idea, but it is false, and it is not the idea that ID politics people who you mentioned intersectionalism, Kimberly Crenshaw. That's absolutely not what she was talking about. We are not talking about having white people feel guilty for their whiteness. We are not talking about how you are doing a percentage better than me. We are talking about institutions that encourage white people to be getting better jobs than Black people. We are talking about institutions where people are, you know, where there is no social safety nets, that they are put into positions where they cannot work to their fullest extent, where they cannot work to their fullest amount of education. And they are, you know, bogged down in the social expectations of whatever their identity is. And again, you can probably assume that I'm speaking from a personal place. I am speaking from a personal place. I was the caretaker of both of my parents who passed away from cancer, and my grandfather. And because of this, I lost the opportunity to get 2 or 3 excellent jobs in the city. And I had to come home and take care of him, live on his couch, live in poverty. And I got nothing from it, essentially. I got a secretary job, and then I was able to be a caretaker, and that's it.
Well, you're describing the system of capitalism. You're not describing the system of male.
Not just capitalism, because again, we are. When you're describing the working class, you have to understand that term was made during a time in which men were the working class and women were at home.
That's men were never the working class.
There were plenty of women workers in the factories of
the triangle.
International Women's Day.
The triangle.
No, but domestic work, though.
But that's also
necessarily related. Let me finish, please. This is necessarily just related to my gender. This is more of a structural thing, because it's true that a man could have ended up in my position. It is absolutely true that the circumstances of my life, a man could have ended up in my position. That's true. However, the societal expectations are that I would go home and take care of my grandfather. So every time I went to a job interview, somebody told me to do that. Told me to do that. I was asked if I was married. I was asked if I had kids. This is not, this is about access to being in the working class, right? I was kept in poverty, am being kept in poverty because I cannot have access to the working class. And there are people who have the education and the know-how to work up from the working class to the petty bourgeoisie and can't get there because of these reasons. Am I wrong? Go ahead.
So this is where I would say that this is exactly a class issue. Yes, you're a woman, but it's not just about being a woman. It's about being a working class woman. Yes, you're expected to take care of your family because you can't afford to pay someone else to take care of your family.
But even in the times when you do, and speaking from somebody who took care of somebody's daughter who was rich because she was a professor at college, but she had to take care of her own daughter. And when it came down to times when you couldn't get care or whatever for her daughter, she was the one taking over, even if she had to do work. But her husband
yes, and one of the problems of the petty bourgeois is that when they can't sufficiently exploit someone else's labor, they still have to labor themselves, which is part of our American false consciousness problem, whereas we see ourselves as working class,
but that doesn't negate
even when we're not.
That
doesn't negate my point, though.
Again, the point is you're talking about access to the petty bourgeoisie.
Could I just make because this is going to be a longer discussion, I think. I would be happy actually to talk to you about some of our motivations in greater detail. I do think in relationship to the evolution of American politics, the adoption by the Democratic Party of identity politics in particular, or what we're calling identity, particularly in the late 60s, it was a response to the rebellions of that period and the elevation of within the state, within corporate America, of minorities, of Black, a small section of the Black population, of women. Social inequality within the Black population has increased enormously, because you have the elevation, in fact, into positions of corporate power. Same for women. So I think, anyway, there's a lot to discuss on this issue. I would just say, for the Socialist Equality Party and as a Marxism, and Trotskyism as the Marxism of the 21st century, the question is the development of an understanding that there is an international working class. There isn't, in a sense, a Black working class, a white working class, an American working class, a Mexican working class. I mean, sometimes one uses the American working class because we're fighting to develop a movement in the American working class. But the working class as a class is united throughout the world objectively in the process of production. It has the same class interests exploited by the same corporations. And that is the foundation of socialist politics, the development of a movement in the working class based on the common class interests of all workers. And I would say that, you're describing your experience. I'm sure that's an experience that many viewing this who happen to be men could say, I've had very similar experiences. For African Americans, I have had very similar caring for,
But my point,
these are experiences of the working class.
For a second, I'm so sorry. My larger point is this. Not necessarily that I am a woman with lady parts, but that this society is built on the impression that there will be somebody to take care of you at home. There will be somebody to do your shopping. There will be somebody to make your clothes or get your clothes or whatever. That is the feminism I'm talking about. That is the patriarchy I'm talking about. I'm not necessarily talking about the fact that I am, prejudices in, interpersonal relationships. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about. Talking about structure.
This topic needs to be a show on its own, because
I'm sorry.
One of the earliest proto-Marxist texts was written by Friedrich Engels about how the modern petty bourgeois nuclear family is used as an ideal to destroy the working class. One of the most fundamental early arguments in American Marxism was between more radical Marxists, who were eventually labeled anarchists by Karl Marx, who examined the full class implications of what Engels was saying about the nuclear family in ways that Marx and Engels were themselves afraid of doing. And it ended with the leaders of the first American putatively Marxist party being thrown out of the First International by Karl Marx and labeled anarchists because they cared because in his opinion they cared too much about women's rights and not enough about class. And in their opinion, they were talking all about how the class system deliberately maintains specific labor responsibilities for women outside of the economically productive system in order to devalue everyone's labor by making it dependent on the access to unpaid labor. Right. Now, this is deeply linked with the exploitation of unmarried women and orphan children
and widowed women
during the Industrial Revolution, when what we think of as the white male worker did not exist. The majority of men were actually unemployed, and all the industrial labor was being done by unmarried women and children.
Back before
sometimes at home while they were doing unpaid work, sometimes in a factory because they did not have a home to do unpaid work in.
I think that Chris, maybe we will have to take you up on your offer at some point about having a further discussion on these questions. I mean, they're critical political questions. We're, I think, 25 minutes over.
We are, and this is why I'm saying that it's worth its own show, because it is important.
I mean, look, these are issues which have to be clarified, and we're happy to discuss this further. I would just conclude is that, in our view, the question is the development of an understanding among all sections of the working class of their shared, and that the system is capitalism. That is the system that workers in every single country confront as a global capitalist system, and that can only be overthrown by uniting workers of all workers on the basis of their common class interests, and that's what we see as the essential question. And I would just say that, I mean, this isn't a utopian dream what we're raising. I mean, this is an absolute necessity. We see everywhere what capitalism is producing. Barbarism on it recalls the worst crimes of the 20th century. And there was an article in the New York Times just this week. Are you ready? Basically, are you ready for nuclear war? Which they say that there isn't enough discussion about the nuclear war, and that we're at the greatest danger of nuclear war since the height of the Cold War. And this is as a result of the policies of the ruling elite. So the question of overthrowing capitalism and of developing a movement in the working class, and just to go back to sort of the overall central point which we're trying to develop in the election is, this is what we have to fight for. And if we don't fight to develop a movement in the working class and really succeed in that struggle, then capitalism is leading us into a catastrophe. So that's what we are fighting to do, and we're fighting to do so on the basis of an understanding in the working class all over the world that they have the same class interests, the same fight against imperialism, the same fight against capitalist exploitation, and therefore the same fight for socialism. And that's what we're seeking to the Socialist Equality Party is seeking to do in the election campaign.
Yeah, and we're saying that in fact there is this normalization, as Joe was saying before, of mass death and the pandemic, mass death and the genocide, normalization of nuclear war. And at the other side of it, there's the emergence of a social force which has been excluded from political life, the international working class, which, by the way, is, with the new developments in technology, is able to communicate, translate into different languages, coordinate their struggles across international borders. And this links together workers of every race, every gender, every nationality against giant transnational corporations and governments who are waging war.
There is a very successful international civil disobedience campaign being waged against an Israeli defense contractor called Elbit Systems that has shut down work in multiple countries.
Yeah, and Will Lehman's call when he went on TikTok and called for American workers to support the Palestinian Union's call to ban the production and shipment of weapons to Israel, got more than 1 million hits. I mean, there is deep disgust with war. There's deep disgust with social inequality. And it's going to get worse as they demand the working class pay for these wars. In Europe now, they're saying, look, you've all been enjoying the peace dividend. Now it's time for the quote, freedom investment. We're going to be doubling the amount to be spent. So what Macron did with raising the retirement age, that's the tip of the iceberg. And they're going to do it here too. Public education, Social Security, Medicare, all of these things are on the chopping block. How are they going to finance these wars? And democratic rights, and it doesn't matter whether it's Trump or Biden in the White House, they're going to seek to suppress opposition, as they have in the course of by the way, I didn't realize that Kamala Harris's husband is in charge of the sort of White House campaign over anti-Semitism. They're labeling every opposition to the Gaza war, and they're joining with real anti-Semites.
Yes,
in the right-wing Republican forces. So there's mass discontent, But there's also an effort to keep this discontent tied to the Democratic Party. Here in Michigan and in other states, there's the Uncommitted campaign pushed by Rashida Tlaib and the DSA. And what, of course, there was a real genuine hatred of what Biden is doing. But those who are promoting this are saying, if we put enough pressure on Biden and the Democrats, we can get them to change their minds. So vote Democrat. And this is an effort to keep this opposition bottled up in an imperialist party. And we're saying no. Joe and I are saying support our campaign, the SCP campaign for president. We're fighting to get on the ballot in Michigan and other states to build a mass political party of the working class, to unite with our brothers and sisters internationally, to put an end to capitalism and fight for socialism.
And in the end, the one thing I will say is that the biggest class reductionists out there are the actual racists who learned when Ronald Reagan was president that if they just made sure they kept hurting a plurality of white people, they could keep on deliberately hurting black people worse because of the inequities in the American class system. And I think it's worth understanding that. And do you have any final thoughts before we close out, Bess?
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add that I wanted to particularly have this conversation with you guys because I respect the work and because I find that you're both very genuine. And you're right, Chris, in saying that there are a lot of class reductionists who are actually racist. I don't believe you guys are. I believe you really do care about everyone. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I do respect the time and studiousness that you've put into your opinions. So again, I will look more into what you've written, and I absolutely encourage everyone else to do so. And I hopefully we will have another conversation on this whenever you have some time. I would love to. And it was really great to meet you guys, and I absolutely support the majority of what you had said, other than our little conflict there. So it was really nice to meet you, and thank you again for listening.
Nice to meet you as well. I appreciate coming on the show. I just say to anyone watching to support our campaign, go to socialism2024.org. You can watch the videos from David North, Jerry, and myself announcing the campaign. Sign up. You know, Jerry mentioned we're fighting to get on the ballot in Michigan. Right now, we have to gather 12,000 signatures just to get on the ballot, and we'll do it. We're gonna do it, but it's gonna be a fight, and we need the support of everyone. We need everyone all over the country, around the world, to sign up and volunteer to help the campaign. Those who can, to donate and to take up this campaign. I mean, this is it's a campaign for the working class, a campaign for the development of a socialist leadership, and it's a campaign against imperialism, genocide, and for socialism, which is the basic question. But I would just include, if everyone watching, go to our website, follow us on social media, but get involved. I mean, it's Jerry and I are not running in this because we're hoping to find ourselves a year from now living in the White House. We're doing this because it's the Socialist Equality Party is carrying out this campaign because we have to fight to build a movement in the working class against capitalism, and that's the basic question. But that's not, it requires people to take up the active fight to do this, and to recognize, based on what is actually happening, that a different social movement, political movement, has to be built, and to take that fight up.
And my final thought before I go is going to be that the irony is that if you care about identity politics in the framework of disability politics and eugenics, as it specifically relates to the problems of disabled people, then the Socialist Equality Party candidates are the ones wearing masks at their campaign events. And I just wanted to make that my final thought. And I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you. Thank you again for having us.
Thank you, Bess.
Discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.